So these three chapters talk about several unique events that happen over several decades worth of time for the prophet Daniel. And in each one, he's interacting with a different king of Babylon, and at the very end, the king of Persia. So probably these transpired over several decades, and each one reflects something that God is trying to teach us out of these three interactions. So when we look at chapter 4, Daniel's interacting with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had known from many years earlier that Daniel had the ability to translate dreams, so Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. In this dream, he sees this giant tree, all these things under the tree from animals. This kind of tree fills the earth, and then an angelic messenger or a heavenly messenger comes down and cuts the tree down. He's panicked by the dream. He knows from his past that Daniel's the guy to go to, so he brings in Daniel to say, Daniel, help me translate the dream. And we see in chapter 4 that Daniel's actually a bit intimidated or scared to tell him the interpretation, because he's saying, if only this wasn't about you, King Nebuchadnezzar, but it was. And this dream essentially was a prophecy that King Nebuchadnezzar would be the one that is cut down. He would lose his kingdom, and what would happen would be that he would essentially become insane. Late in his life, he would have a bout with insanity, and he would lose his kingdom. And so Daniel is predicting and prophesying this to Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar receives it and receives Daniel. He has a love for Daniel, it seems, or at least a respect for Daniel, and he goes on his way. And so about a year later, King Nebuchadnezzar, this chapter tells us, is walking on his roof. He is basically bragging about the greatness of Babylon, and a voice from heaven brings the prophecy to light. King Nebuchadnezzar loses his mind and lives for a number of years, essentially in the wilderness like a wild animal. And only until he comes back and he says that God is the true God and sovereign, and he worships God, does God restore his kingdom to him. So then we move maybe several decades, or at least a decade or so, to the future, and now Daniel we see interacting in chapter 5 with Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar. And in this, you may have heard of this story and seen maybe even this in times past being told. Belshazzar at a banquet, at an event where he's basically celebrating his greatness. He's bringing in articles of gold and articles that were from the temple there in Jerusalem to use for just his party to impress his guests. All of a sudden, he sees on a wall the hand of God. It looks like a human hand, but it's the hand of God writing a message. And the Bible even tells us that his face went ashen and pale. He's terrified. No one, his wise men, his astrologers, no one could interpret what the words meant. His wife remembers that Daniel had been one that Nebuchadnezzar had called on. So he brings Nebuchadnezzar in, and he asks Nebuchadnezzar to tell him this dream. And again, Nebuchadnezzar is a bit anxious to present these results, because the interpretation is that essentially, though you are bragging about your greatness, you've been found wanting, and your kingdom is about to come to an end. And chapter 5 tells us that at the end of that night, that Belshazzar was killed, and Darius, who was a Persian king, became leader of ancient Babylon, and the Persians then began to take over what had been the Babylonian kingdom. So then in chapter 6, we move ahead and we see maybe one of the most famous Bible stories of all. We see Daniel in the lion's den. And here we see King Darius, and while King Darius seemed to have a love and a respect for Daniel, others in the kingdom did not, possibly jealous because of Daniel's position, because of his renown, even as a Jewish exile. It's interesting how in chapter 6, these that are trying to trick Darius into ensnaring Daniel refer to him, even late in Daniel's life now, that some scholars think that Daniel may have even been 80 years old when this is happening, that Daniel is still being referred to as the Jewish exile. He was being targeted for that. They didn't like the fact that an exile had risen to this level of prominence and leadership within the kingdom of Babylon, now Persia. And so Darius makes a proclamation. Again, the common theme here is presenting themselves and how great they are and refusing to acknowledge the greatness of God. And so now Daniel is come to called upon to worship this huge image, this image the Bible says is 60 cubits high that Darius had erected, that he called everyone, all of his leaders, all of his wise men, everybody in positions of power, which Daniel was high in the kingdom at that time, to fall down and worship. Well, Daniel wouldn't do it. Matter of fact, the Bible tells us that not only did Daniel worship in private, that he opened his window to the street and he continued to pray to God as he had done for years so that everyone could see. Well, all those that were trying to trick Darius and entrap Daniel brought this to Darius' attention, and Darius was basically caught in that he had to punish Daniel with what we know as the classic punishment of throwing him into the lion's den. Interesting about the lion's den, the ancient Mesopotamian kings, it was traditional that they would have these massive lion hunts. So it was very common for these kings to keep essentially a den, a pit, a huge kind of gathering of lions that they would use to hunt. And they would release these lions. There's actually ancient archaeological finds that have reliefs and carvings that depict from this era these hunts of these kings and hunting lions. So it really was the sport of kings to hunt lions. But these lions were trained to be vicious. This was definitely not a petting zoo. So Daniel is thrown down there. Now Darius is anxious and nervous because Darius seems to have some respect, if not love, for Daniel. But all night long, Darius is worried. Daniel's in the lion's den. The next morning, he comes, and we know the story well, is that Daniel says, God has shut the mouths of the lions. So again, where Darius had called upon the nation and called upon everybody to bring glory to himself, God is supernaturally intervening to demonstrate that he is sovereign and that he is the one worthy of true glory. So we have three distinct events, three somewhat well-known to very well-known stories happening over possibly decades worth of time, and Daniel has taken time to write these stories for each of us to see. The common thread, the common thread we see running through all of these is that God is sovereign. Babylon, Persia, maybe some of the greatest, if not greatest, empires and kingdoms of that whole era of that time. And certainly these kings and rulers viewed themselves not only as just emperors, but potentially as gods themselves and presented themselves as gods to their people. Yet in each of these instances, God is directly intervening to remind them, yes, Babylon, I may have used you as my instrument of judgment, but you still are under me in my leadership. As great as you are, Darius, as great as you are, Nebuchadnezzar, as great as you think you are, Belshazzar, I am sovereign and I am king over all. And not only that, we begin to see in Daniel here this transition of not only presenting God as the Jews are in exile and have been there for many years now, that not only is God the God of the Israelites, the God of the nation of Israel, the God of Judah, but he is the God of all people, the God of all nations. And these kingdoms, their leaders, these kingdoms are called into account to recognize the sovereignty of God. And not just to look at God as maybe one of many of the people they've conquered, but that God is the true God. And in each of these instances, it's interesting how these kings respond, you are the true God, God. But then obviously they fade away in their actions over time, reveal compromise and falling away from that belief and holding true to that. And finally, we bring this home to us today, right? We see the sovereignty of God in Daniel and how God was sovereign over Daniel's life, over these kings and kingdoms. And yet, today we need to understand that God is sovereign in our life. We've faced a lot of things like Daniel. Daniel was an influencer, he was a leader, but he was not in control of all the circumstances around him. Daniel could have been called, and he was called on the carpet in these stories, at a moment's notice by a king who could have lost his life. He could have been killed by the king in any moment. So he was influencer, but he was out of control. And we see in our lives, maybe we're people and we can have influence over our lives, our culture, but we also don't completely control them, right? Something else is happening. Things happen around us. This pandemic is out of our control. The election that's coming up here in a few months is out of our control. But we're reminded that God is sovereign over this pandemic, that God is sovereign later in November, regardless of the results of this upcoming election. And God is sovereign in our lives and even the things that are just personal to us, and the big and the small. And knowing that God is sovereign, we know that God cares and God sees, despite how big, despite how small. He sees us through those circumstances. He knows and He cares. And just like Daniel in the lion's den, and God shut the mouths of those lions, God didn't keep Daniel out of that lion's den, but God protected and carried him through, and God saw His purposes through that. Some scholars believe that because of Darius being put in that position, and later the king Cyrus that soon after followed Darius, that these Persian kings, because of this instance and because of what they saw in Daniel's life here, grew in their affection for the Jews and the exiles, and part of that led to them allowing the exiles to return home and return to their homeland. So God cares for you. God is sovereign over you. God is sovereign over us. And that, I think, is the encouragement we can take today of